Very good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our salon. I think it's going to be a really entertaining one. That's me, Paul Donato. Before we get started, I just have a couple of events that the ARF is doing that I wanted to highlight for you. So on August 6th, we have the sports marketing event, and then on August 14th, we have a very popular leadership lab, which is about incrementality and measuring brand lift. October 22nd, if you're on the West Coast, our OTT event, and then finally data analytics on November 13th. And we also have a full one-day track at Adweek, and you'll see there's a promotion on the bottom. Tomorrow's the last day of that promotion, and if you're buying a ticket to Adweek, we ask you, could you please use the code ARF 2019? And basically what you'll do is get the association rate, which is the lowest possible rate that you can get. So it's a good deal. And that not only entitles you to our event, but the entire Adweek event. And then finally, at the end of Adweek, we have the dinner for the Ogilvy Awards, where it's now 25 years, the Ogilvy Awards, and it's probably the most well-known award for the use of research in the development of creative. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. May need some windshields here to do this. I've seen the presentation. It looks absolutely awesome. So Matthew Wilcox. Matthew is founding partner of the Business of Choice, a word that you're going to hear a lot about today, a behavioral insights and choice consultancy that helps organizations develop communications and experiences aligned with how people naturally choose things. He's one of the pioneers of the application of behavioral science and insights to the practice of marketing. He's got highly awarded books, one of which he'll be talking about tonight, including The Business of Choice, Marketing to Consumers' Instincts. That was named by M&SB's Marketing Book of the Year, and also the winner of the American Marketing Association's prestigious Berry Book Prize in 2016. So I'm looking forward to this presentation. I know the slides look awesome, and please welcome Matthew.
Thank you. Can I trouble you for the clicker? Oh, there it is, thank you.
Sorry.
I always do this. I kind of I've walked off a presentation with a clicker in my pocket and sort of gone to my next meeting, leaving people fumbling around for the clicker. Thank you very much for coming this evening. This might sound like a strange question. Has anybody had a birthday this week? Wow. I'm not sure what the statistical chances of that. It's at least a 1 in 50 chance. Anybody got a birthday next week? Last week. Ah, fantastic. So as a belated birthday present, here is a copy of The Business of Choice. There you go.
Thank you.
Sorry. So let me just, everyone likes to talk about themselves, don't they? So let me just tell you a little bit about how I got to where I got to in my interest of understanding how people choose. Kind of a seminal point was I was asked by the lady who's now the global CMO of Levi Strauss & Company, Jen Stay, is a fantastic marketer, to give her a definition for a presentation of, yes. Of course. Thank you very much. I might have to sort of do another button of my shirt up. I'm not going to do them all up though, and I promise I'm not going to undo all of them either. Thank you, Jason. Oops. How's that? Is that a little better? Okay, so maybe if I kind of, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Jen was giving a talk at a conference, and she wanted a definition of marketing that was kind of modern, but still kind of spoke to the fundamentals of what marketing is about. And I was her account planner at FCD at the time. So kind of the first thing I did was what anybody in that situation would do is I went hunting on the internet to try and find definitions of marketing. And I don't know if any of you have searched definitions of marketing. There's a whole wiki of 70 plus different definitions of marketing. When you look at this, it's like kind of, some of them seem so old and tired. There's the classic, I don't know if it's David Akers or who wrote it, which is marketing is about sort of meeting consumer demand while making a profit. There's all of the ones about the 4 Ps. And, marketing, many organizations are doing what I would call marketing and not necessarily doing it driven by profit. So that kind of rules out that one. The 4 Ps sounds a very sort of old-fashioned approach in a world of engagement and influence of other people. So I ended up writing one myself, which I've used ever since, and it just kind of set me on a voyage of discovery. And that definition was that marketing is the creation, management, and measurement of programs designed to influence the choices you need people to make to meet your objectives. And I just want to talk about that a little bit because, you know, every organization has objectives. Whether it is what you're doing at Citibank, whether it is a parent-teacher association, whether it is a social development organization trying to wipe out a serious disease. Every organization has objectives. But the interesting thing, to me at least, is that they can only achieve those objectives if they get people to make the choices that they need to make. And so the interesting kind of thing there is that you're actually dependent on the choices of others. Whatever your objectives are, it's not so much about what you do, it's what other people choose. So really kind of working out how you can influence people to make the choices which will let you get to where you need to get to is a vital and critical thing. So not surprisingly, I talk about how we're all in the business of choice, which is where I got the title of my book from. And, you know, even though the subtitle of my book is Marketing to Consumers' Instincts, I regretted that as soon as I said it to the publisher, and they wouldn't let me change it, because I really don't care much for the word consumer. Especially in this day and age, I think, where you know, consuming is not really what we should be, outright consumption is not what we should be encouraging people to do from an environmental perspective. But it's also kind of a little, I feel, debasing of people to define them on their consumption, on what they consume. And the term I use, and this is not my term, but I borrowed it from Sheena Iyengar, who wrote an excellent book called The Art of Choosing, is really to talk about the people whose choices we need to influence as choosers. So if only one of you sort of leaves this room and starts using the word chooser instead of consumer, I will feel that I've at least done something today. But what I also like about it is it speaks to what marketing is centrally about, which is influencing choice. It actually speaks to what brands are centrally about. I think one of the issues, I think calling, you know, the phrase consumer-centric has been sort of drummed into all of us as marketing professionals. And how I like to think about what we do is not about necessarily putting the consumer or even the chooser at the center of what we do, but actually putting the decisions they're making, the choices they're making at the center of what we do. And I call this a choice-centric approach to marketing. What I mean is that sort of try to understand as much as you can what goes into the choice that you need people to do, what influences the choice that you need people to make, what are the, you know, and we'll talk a bit about this, what are the cognitive mechanisms that might activate or might stop people from making the choice that you need them to make. And I think this idea of just really focusing on the choice you need people to make is a very powerful and focused way to think about marketing. When I think about brands, they fit into this model as well. The role of marketing is to make choice easy, natural, and rewarding for the chooser. But that's actually what brands do. The very best brands do exactly that. They make choice almost a no-brainer. They make choice rewarding because you kind of feel good about the choice to choose them. So, as Paul said, choice is a word you're going to hear me say a lot, mainly because I just think it is such an important thing to think about in the work that we all do. Now, on that subject, I've been asking a few of you just to kind of think about choices that you need people to make that maybe they're not making at the moment, because we'll try to sort of think about those as we go through the content of some of the work we're doing. I've got a great example from Leslie, from Citibank, and I've got a great example, which is a personal one. It's John, is it? Yeah. From John. Anybody else got something that they would, I wish I could get people to do this? It can be a professional thing. It can be a personal thing. Anybody got any things that they would like to offer up for us to dissect and think about later on? I've got 2 or 3 already, so don't feel any pressure. I'm using social proof there to kind of make you feel comfortable about this. Yes?
Maybe get people to use less plastic.
Say again, sorry.
Get people to use less plastic.
Yes, less plastic. That's a fantastic idea. Okay, we will take that one on board and talk about that. It's actually something I've done a project on with some people in the room recently, actually, so that's great. Okay. So the great thing about the work I do and some of the other people in the room do is that if you're trying to understand choice, hallelujah that it is 2019 and not 1987, because we understand a lot more about how people choose now than we have done. In fact, we're learning more. I mean, pretty much every every 6 months or so, there's something interesting. Oh, that's another interesting perspective on how people choose. It's not an exaggeration to say that we're in a golden age of decision sciences. And like all golden ages, they're kind of driven by three things. One is, some truly remarkable breakthrough thinkers. You may recognize, I know some of you in the room will certainly recognize these two people. This picture wasn't taken together, but they have been in the same room together. On this side, you have Richard Thaler, who is a behavioral economist, comes from an economics background, won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2017, I think. And this is Daniel Kahneman, author of Thinking Fast and Slow, who won the Nobel Prize for economics back in about 2002. Interesting that Kahneman's a psychologist, not an economist, and is only the second psychologist to win the Nobel Prize for economic sciences. So, but people like these, and there's probably about 50, amazing academics around the world who've contributed as much as these two. They've kind of really changed how we understand choice and how we think about choice. What actually adds to that is this huge body of people studying behavioral science around the world. When I wrote my book, I calculated there was about 5,000 people who were studying different aspects of choice. It's probably closer to 10,000 people now. It's just such a popular subject. But the great thing about this as a resource is that there are people, whatever aspect of choice you're trying to influence, there is probably somebody somewhere who is studying something that relates to it. And so one of the things that I do with my clients is the first thing when they talk about the choices they're trying to influence is try to find either the literature or the academic themselves who's studying an area like that. And you can just get a great head start on understanding the area simply by doing that. The third thing, and some of you, one of the sponsors I think is Spark Neuro. The third thing that sort of kind of completes this kind of further understanding of choice, this voyage of understanding more about choice that we're on, is technology. Things like this is a picture of this is a picture of an fMRI scanner. And along with other neuro techniques, it gives some indication of sort of what's actually happening at a neural level, what's happening in terms of really the biology of people's brains when they're given tasks and when they're making choices. So all of these things add up to just give us a fuller picture of choice than we've had before. But what does it really tell us? I love this quote from Baba Shiv. Baba was a great help to me when I was writing my book, and he is an academic at Stanford Graduate Business School. And he says, our rational brain simply rationalizes what our intuitive brain has already decided to do. And I think it's kind of an interesting quote because he's not saying that people are irrational. He's just saying that these intuitions, these instincts kick in more quickly and actually are sort of getting our choices on the way before we start to think deliberatively and rationally about them. So it's kind of important to understand these intuitive processes because they are really the things that get our choices rolling. Many of you will be familiar with the cognitive mechanisms that are kind of called heuristics and cognitive biases. I'm going to talk a bit about some of these later on. There's I think on the last count on a wiki list, there was about 115 of them. Some of them have names that sound like they were invented by psychology students during a drinking game. And you've got the von Restroff effect, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, the IKEA effect, which is not an aversion to buying products at IKEA, but is simply that when you put something together yourself, when you put effort into it, you're likely to value it more than if you didn't. This is the bane of realtors' lives when they're trying to sell houses because people who've kind of done work on the house themselves always massively overvalue what their house is worth, and the retailers have to sort of talk them down to avoid disappointment. But these are sort of a range of things that actually sort of affect people's choices. This is really what a lot of the work of people like Thaler and Kahneman have unearthed. But I think there's another important part of the story of how we choose, and I kind of call this the natural history of choice. A number of years ago, I was doing a talk which was called The Caveman and Cavewoman Behind the Keyboard. The idea was that sort of even though we're using all of this technology and sort of we live in this digital era, it's still really sort of an ancient brain that is making the choices behind the technology. And this is a woman called Dean Falk. She's the one in the middle. She is a professor, she's called a paleoanthropologist, which means she sort of does anthropology through fossils and artifacts of the past. And I spoke to Professor Falk, and so her name is Dean, which is confusing. It's actually her first name, but so I spoke to Professor Dean Falk, which sounds like a double academic title. And I said, just tell me a bit about the evolution of how we make choices and the processes we use. And I said, how much? And I was still learning about the subject then. So how much has it changed in, I don't know, going back as far as ancient Egyptians? And she said, ancient Egyptians, that's about 6,000 years ago. In terms of the evolution of the brain, that is essentially today. And I think it's just something for us to remember that sort of, so many of the things that drive our choices, we tend to think of ourselves very much at the moment. We tend to think of evolution as affecting our bodies. I mean, we have these wonderful thumbs that can grip things, the opposable thumb, but we tend to forget that actually sort of our brain has got such a history as well. And I would argue that, important though the opposable thumb is, the evolution of our decision-making systems is probably the most significant thing which has got humans to where humans have got. Hello, how are you? Has got humans to where humans have got to today. So I think, you have to think about sort of the history of choice as well. It wasn't always as difficult and complex as it is now. There weren't quite so many options. But it's important to remember that, we are, all of us, the product of a long string of choices. So, we all got to this room because we made some decisions ourselves, but we were in a position to get into this room because our ancestors, generation before generation before generation, actually made choices that worked pretty well. And these are so deeply baked into us. The way we make these choices is deeply baked into us. And one of the terms I use, rather than talking about behavioral economics and behavioral sciences, I talk about this as human nature. One of the things that we have to factor into how people make choices is how does human nature affect the choices that you need people to make? One way is that sort of our brain works very, very quickly. So we kind of, many people refer to things that these people use the term subconscious sometimes, which is not a good term to use in the context of decision making. But I prefer the term preconscious because it's kind of essentially what's happening is these choices bubble up and happen before we're consciously aware of them. And they're extremely efficient. The processes that lead us to this are extremely efficient. One of the, one reason for this is that even though our brain is only about 2% of our body mass, it uses a lot of energy. And it particularly uses energy when we're going through deliberative decision making. So Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, says, if you're walking along with somebody and you say to them, multiply 17 by 646, they will probably stop walking. It's almost like sort of that is as much a physical effort as it is a cognitive effort. And so the way these instincts and intuitions that drive our choices sort of, are born out of efficiency and speed. This picture, I think, says more about human nature than any image I've found. I mean, we've all done this. It's kind of, there's a perfectly good, tarmac pathway here, yet our intuition, our instinct, is to try to take the shortcut all the time. And the reason for that is a couple of things. One is it's quicker, obviously, but it's also saving us energy. We're really, really good at figuring out how to save energy. I wish I was as good at working out how much energy I took on board by eating the cranberry muffin that I ate before I came to this meeting as I am about sort of working out and avoiding the things which will use energy as I walk around. But we're really, really good at sort of following that path of least resistance, of least effort. And these cognitive, we use physical shortcuts, but we also sort of cognitive shortcuts define how we think and how we make choices, because they're quick and efficient mental processes. Now, shortcuts are not always good things. This example you might have seen is somebody who took a shortcut. Now, this sounds like the stupidest thing in the world to say, but this wouldn't have been a problem if that bridge wasn't there. And actually, this is what happens with cognitive shortcuts in real life, or what indeed cognitive biases in real life, because they evolved over a time when many of the obstacles in the modern world weren't there. So we have these behaviors that made perfect sense 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, maybe even 200 years ago, which make less sense now. Saving for retirement is an example. Saving for retirement didn't really make much sense when life expectancy was 32, 45, or 57. But now, as we live longer, it makes more sense to do it. But it's not in our human nature to do it. So the interesting thing about this is the thing on the back which says, our most valuable resource sits 63 feet ahead, so I'm not sure if he was ultimately the most valuable resource. But just as I found another picture, which actually I thought, well, this is amazing, because this is a good visual metaphor for a cognitive bias. And this one is a great metaphor for a really effective intervention. And it's good because it does a couple of things. First of all, if you hit it, you know you've done something. It's very, very timely. It's very visceral. It's going to hit you instinctively. It's not asking you really to process something. And it may well have the effect of you not driving through the bridge. So, you know, ever since I've been involved in this area, kind of people say, oh God, it's so interesting to think about why people do what they do. But I think actually, I've come to appreciate that this may be a bigger question. Why people don't do what they don't do. Because, you know, we tend to focus a lot on trying to get people to do things. But really the key to getting people to sort of start a journey, if you're going to build momentum, you've somehow got to to defeat inertia first. And there are many, many reasons why people don't do what they don't do. This is a model I use in my consulting work, and I kind of try to encourage clients to think about what in all of these buckets are reasons why people aren't doing what you want to do. What in human nature might be stopping people? What in culture and context might be stopping people? What are systemic factors? What are aspects of brand that might be stopping people? And indeed, how might your marketing activities not be having the desired effect? I'll give you an example. I was working with a life insurance company in Asia a couple of years ago. And life insurance in Asia, I think the penetration of life insurance in Asia is about a quarter of what it is in the US. It's much lower. And we kind of identified a number of areas. I mean, the first one is actually, so life insurance is a difficult sell to humans, full stop, wherever those humans are, whatever culture they come from. One of the reasons is a thing called optimism bias. We just don't think bad things are going to happen to us. This is why most people who live in California, which is where I live, don't have earthquake insurance, even though there's a very high chance of an earthquake in the next 30 years. Also, life insurance is in the distance, and we tend not, we'll talk about this later on, we tend to discount the future consequences of things. Particularly in Southeast Asia, culture and context have an effect. I lived in Thailand for 5 years, so I saw this firsthand. But you know, there is a great sense of family. It is almost an insult to your family to take out life insurance because it suggests that your family can't take care of you if something goes wrong, or can't take care of your family, the people you leave behind. So on the one hand, it's kind of, I don't want to upset people by doing it, and also life insurance seems like a bit of a waste of money because there is that informal life insurance there. There are systemic factors. It's actually more difficult to buy life insurance. It's just not as established a market. There are, in some countries, government plans that provide, you know, the provident plans that you pay into as a form of taxation that provide some level of life insurance. And in their case as well, their brand was just not as well known as their brand is in Europe and the US. And then finally, their marketing activities were really tuned to the wrong message. They were telling people that most people didn't have life insurance. They were talking about how there was a protection gap, how most people had a protection gap. There was a big gap between what they had and what their life was worth and the insurance cover they had. So all of those in one way or another presented barriers. Another model I use to talk about barriers, this comes from he's written a number of great books, one of which is Drunk Tank Pink, a guy called Adam Alter, is the different, I mean, this affects choice and it affects both why people do things and why people don't do things. But it's always good to go through these areas and think about what might be stopping people from doing something in each of them. And how Adam talks about it, he talks about the world around us. He talks about how culture, language, symbols, systems, and environments affect behavior. So that's kind of like sort of how, you know, how if it's difficult to find something in a store, that is essentially a system problem. I talked about sort of the Southeast Asian culture aspect of families giving protection. It becomes a cultural thing. So these are the things that exist in the world around us. Another area is the world between us, which is how other people affect our choices, whether because they are influencers, whether because they're not doing something. It could be about, and this happens a lot in pharma, in the world of pharma solutions, as in not pharma as in people who plow fields, but pharma as in drug companies, which is, you know, sort of relationships are absolutely critical to what people will or won't do. Your expectations of people affect your behavior too. And then finally, you have the world within us, which is the cognitive mechanisms I've been speaking about a little bit, which is this idea, you know, these shortcuts that we use to intuitively make decisions. And you have to really think about how do any of these and all of them affect the choices you want people to make. So this whole question of why people don't do what they want to do. There's a great book by Amitav Chakravarty and Magnus Thomas called Why People Don't Buy. And it talks about go and stop signals. And there's a phrase that they say effective marketing entails strengthening go signals and weakening stop signals. And I contend that we focus far too much on the strengthening of go signals rather than the weakening of stop signals. And it's partly human nature that makes us do that as marketers. I've, in my consulting work, reviewed many customer decision journeys, customer journeys, and I would say probably about 80% of the cases, the weight is focused on thinking about how can we get the people to do something? Where is the opportunity to sort of give them a go rather than understanding the potential effects of the stop? And not doing stuff is a big deal. I mean, a classic case which affects people's health and affects the economy and society is not taking medication. So 50% of medications for chronic diseases are not taken as prescribed. It's kind of crazy when you think about it because these things are designed to make people better and can help people get better, but people aren't taking them. So non-compliance costs, I think, $299 billion every year in the US. I think it costs $50 billion in Europe. And there's as many as 125,000 deaths annually from cardiovascular diseases, which can be attributed to people not taking their medicine regularly. 23% of admissions to nursing homes could be reduced, and 10% of hospital admissions. So it's kind of, when you think, I mean, it's one of those things. Why do people not do this? I mean, why do people not do many of the things that it makes common sense to do? And we're going to talk about some of those reasons. Here is I think as well in market research, so this is Ellis Roberts from Beazley, who I've worked with on a number of projects. These are a behavioral science and strategy and research firm. And as he said, I sort of asked him about this kind of idea, why do you think it is people don't focus on this not doing things? Why do they keep focusing on doing? He says even in the world of customer and consumer insights, more often than not, marketers are laser focused on using research to understand what might motivate people to choose their product. But behavioral science would suggest that the route to success will be to first truly understand why people don't do what you want them to do. So I think even the way we design research, which is the starting point of so many of our insights, is biased towards the do rather than understanding the don't. Does that concur with your experience as marketers and insights? It's not a surprising thing because we always want to take the positive approach to things. We always want to find where the yes is. I spoke recently to Aline Halsworth, who's the head of behavioral science at Pattern Health, which is an offshoot of Duke University. And we were just talking about this thing of people not doing stuff. And she said in many health programs, you know, when you're trying, this is at an individual level, when you're trying to get people to change their behavior, very often, you know, coaches and advisors will tell you to focus on this positive change. But she says it's simply not enough to do that. It's not enough to simply visualize your goals. What you have to do is think through the obstacles. Think about why you might not do the thing and actually visualize that. So when that thing crops up, like not getting up in the morning to go to the gym, you've thought about it and you've thought about a way around it. So often we think we will get there through this forward momentum, and not enough do we think about how we might need to take away some of the inertia. So what I'd like to do is talk a bit and try and sort of bring some of the examples that you've had into how human nature, I had that slide earlier on which said human nature is one part. So this is not the barriers to choice, and the reasons why people won't do things are very many. But I think the first thing is to understand what aspects of human nature might be stopping people. And am I pointing this in the wrong direction? Ooh. You couldn't move the slide on. For some reason I'm just, there you go. Oh, perfect, thank you. So one really, I mean, I always feel embarrassed saying this, but one major reason why people don't do things, it's just a bit too difficult. And sometimes just a teeny weeny bit too difficult. I mean, we are masters at figuring out the easiest route. If we have to check an extra box, if we have to walk an extra 2 yards, we'll probably favor the option that doesn't require us to do either of those. So one barrier is that, and I don't know if the battery in this has run out, or maybe I've turned it off. But, I mean, what's the... I've been plagued with clicker problems today. Would you mind if I just tell you when to move on to the next slide? Okay. Okay. I've de-energized it. I've taken all of the energy from the batteries in the clicker. Yeah. The clicker found it too difficult. So I mentioned, I showed a picture earlier on of Richard Thaler. Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist. He says he's learned 2 things in his career. I'm sure he's learned a lot more, but he said these are the 2 most important things. I'm going to tell you one of them. He says, if you want to encourage someone to do something, make it easy. And so often we forget this. So often we want people to engage more. We want people to sort of be a little bit more interested in us and our brand or whatever it is. But actually, if you want to just try to make that path as seamless and friction-free as possible. Now, I kind of would add to this as we go to the next slide. Okay? If you want someone not to do something, just make it a little bit more difficult. And there's great examples of this. I'm going to show you one here, which is a study, actually a sort of intervention that Dan Ariely did with Google's New York office. If you can just, should we work out some kind of code when I want to go to the next signal? Shall I say it or shall I signal? Why don't I'll hold this up in the air. How's that? Okay. Perfect. Sorry, it's not the slide I was expecting, but that's my fault, not the clicker's fault. Our desire is really to have sort of things. I mean, we're so drawn to simple that very often we will make a choice which is not aligned to our goals or even is wrong. And we're so averse to complexity that even though that might lead us to the right place, as this diagram, I think it was this, a cartoon was in The Economist, we're kind of like, the vast majority of people will take that path of simple but wrong over complex but right. But back to Dan Ariely's experiment. So the New York headquarters of Google had a problem relating to M&Ms. And this problem is, I'm sure you may have worked for the Facebooks, Googles, Twitters of this world. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I know many people who have gone to work for those organizations, and they talk about something called the Facebook 5. And the Facebook 5 is the £5 you will put on in the first 5 weeks of working at Facebook because there is so much food around. So free food everywhere. And I mean, it's basically a plan to keep people working sort of 18-hour days so they don't need to go home for dinner. But they had M&Ms around. Now, Google does no evil, so they say. And they had these M&Ms around. They thought, it's really not quite the best thing to be giving people, given the health, giving people unlimited sort of sugar and high-calorie snacks. What can we do about it? We can't take them away. You can't treat people like babies. And what's happening is people are going from meeting to meeting, and they're like scooping up the M&Ms so that they kind of, they get a bit bored, they walk out and go and get some more M&Ms. And so they asked Ariely what they might do about it, what might be a way that they could gracefully kind of stop this massive consumption of M&Ms. And his solution was this. Simple. Just put a lid on the jar of M&Ms. Just make it a little bit more difficult. And this was based on other research. There's research that shows that if you leave an ice cream cabinet open, ice cream sales will go up 10%. If you close it, they'll go back down to what they were before. Just that simple thing. It's almost like there is no real, it's just, I never cease to be amazed how the introduction of a little bit of effort or the reduction of a little bit of effort will change behavior. And this effect had, this intervention reduced consumption. I've read a couple of reports. One says by 3 million pieces over a 3 or 4 month period. The other says by 3 million calories. I'm not sure what that equates to in pieces. But it still had a significant effect. We tried a much less scientific experiment in our office with essentially a kind of trail mix with a lot of M&Ms in it. We left the jar open, and we found that they pretty much was emptied within a day. We did a jar with a lid, and we found it lasted a week. So just that sort of simple little effort. So making something more difficult is a way of stopping people from doing the things you don't want them to do. It's actually interesting. One of the things that has worked to increase vaccines in some areas is asking people who are saying they don't want to give their kids vaccinations, they're not going to give the vaccinations themselves. They don't want to have their kids vaccinated, asking them to write a short paragraph about why that is. And that, you have to give them a vaccination unless you write this short paragraph. And just the effort of doing that will move people from saying, I don't want this, to being okay with it. Thank you. This is a an interesting, so getting people to get diabetes tests. It's a difficult thing because it requires getting people to fast, and a lot of people who turn up at diabetes tests, oh, sorry, I had a cup of coffee this morning, or I had that Kit Kat before I came, and of course they can't do the test. But the Qatari Health Authority came up with a really simple way of making it easy, which was they scheduled tests in Ramadan, which is when people are already fasting. So again, finding how you can take those barriers away. Significant barriers fasting, a great solution is to find a time to do the tests when people are already fasting. If I make a noise like that as well, that might help too much. Yeah. I was talking, earlier on about work with NGOs. I was talking to Paul about this. We both have worked with a number of NGOs. And one of the big issues that bedevils children growing up in sub-Saharan Africa is diarrheal disease. And so the Innovations for Poverty Action estimate that about 2 million children die every year of diarrheal disease. And, this is often caused by contaminated water. Just simply treating the water with chlorine could substantially reduce the toll. Problem is, how do you get people to put chlorine in their water? And many of the programs people have given out free chlorine, they've delivered it to people's houses, but people just forget. Somebody said to me the other day, in fact, it was on my flight over, the flight attendant forgot to bring me my cup of coffee, and she said, 2 steps and 2 seconds is all it takes to forget. And she's absolutely right. You can have this stuff at home, and you can still forget to do it. And it can just, it's just a bit too much effort to get it. But what IPA did was they came up with this great, thank you very much. Did you do that? That's fantastic. They came up with this great solution, which was to put chlorine dispensers right next door to where people were getting the water from. So they kind of brought the actions together, the action of getting water to the action of putting chlorine in the water. There's a couple of other things, and we're going to, if you've got this already, you're star students, but there's a couple of other things about why this works. Anybody care to suggest why it might work? Some of you probably know the answer from work that you've done before. Absolutely. So what's happening here is seeing other people adopting the behavior is one of the things that leads us to adopt that behavior ourselves. So by making it visible, and we'll come on to this a bit later, one reason, I'm getting 20 slides ahead of myself, but one reason why people won't do the things that you need them to do is they don't see other people doing them. So this made the act of chlorinating your water a public thing, almost a socially visible thing. Thank you. There's a great book for your reading list, a very short book called The Effortless Experience by Nick Tobin and Matthew Dixon. And this is it's actually about customer loyalty and customer service, and they really say what you've got to do is make things easy. So I've probably given you the hypothesis of the book, or the thesis of the book. But I think sort of other areas, marketers need to embrace the same thing. We need to work out how to make our marketing easy to process, and actually to make the choices that we need people to make easier, and actually maybe give more weight to the things that will be easier for people to do. When organizations identify the choices that they need people to make, they tend to do it, in my experience, on two things. Well, what choices do we need people to make and reach our goals, which I talked about earlier on, and what choices do people seem to want when we've done our research? What do they say they want? What do we know from what people have bought that they need? I would add a third to that, which is thank you. What requires the least effort on the part of the chooser? So a way to think about when you're thinking about your objectives and what you need people to do, sometimes the things that they say they want may not be as easy for them to do. Or indeed, very often the things that we need them to do because they will help us make profit or whatever aren't easy to do. But actually sort of thinking about which of these choices can help us that requires least effort. I think those choices should be bumped up in sort of in terms of your priorities. So I think there's a big thing here. Many of you are involved in the consumer insight space, and there are some ways of doing this, but I think thinking about how a marketer can understand the relative ease of an intervention or a choice is a really, really important thing. So think about techniques to do that. There are some techniques that you can do that with already, but I don't see that built into marketing research thinking enough. So I'm going to put you to work for a little bit. Just a couple of ideas that people had of things they need people to do. So it's making it easy. What, when you take, and I forgot your name, sorry. Katya. So take Katya's example of reducing plastic. How might we, what is there anything, so if not enough people are using, sorry, if too many people are using plastic, not enough people are stopping using plastic, how might we make it easier for them to stop? Any thoughts and suggestions? Say sorry. Stop inviting it. Okay, stop. That's a classic thing. Actually, in the conversations I have with companies that use plastic, the key thing I said is, this is not a consumer problem. This is your problem, and it's got to be systemic within your organisation to stop using. I mean, plastic is an easy choice for them, and perhaps the organisations need to make it a little bit more difficult. I guess also one thing is not just using plastic, but recycling it. I mean, what ways might you make recycling easier? I have a constant problem with recycling. Every time I try to recycle something, I'm like, which bin does this go in? And it's different wherever I go, and it's certainly different in whatever country you go to. And I'm in like a state of cognitive chaos because I'm like, I just don't know what to do. I feel a little foolish that I don't know what to do. There's no easy way for me to work out where I should be putting my stuff. So I think there needs to be almost and government's not going to do it, but organizations need to get together and say, there is a system, there is a standard, which is you recycle, the green does this, the blue does that, and this can go. I mean, so often it's like, I don't even know if this is recyclable or not. So I think sort of there are things that municipalities could do to encourage that. This is one of the biggest areas for me that was a revelation as I started to learn more about how people choose. So you're probably familiar with the idea of loss aversion. Loss aversion is, thank you, the prospect of a loss has a bigger effect on our behavior than the prospect of an equally sized gain. This comes from work in the area of prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky. But essentially the idea is that sort of, the psychological effect, the behavioral effect of the prospect of a loss of $100 is greater, in some cases twice as great, in some cases less, in some cases more, than the prospect of a $100 gain. Sparky Anderson, the baseball coach, I think of the Detroit Tigers, though I'm no baseball fan, put it very well. He said, losing hurts twice as bad as winning feels good. And he was exactly on the money. We are essentially all of us, it's human nature to be loss averse. Now, there are a number of different things. It changes, it's not a stable thing. It is contextually dependent, but by and large, loss aversion is something that humans feel. Next slide. So here's an experiment that was conducted in the Washington, D.C. area about 6 or 7 years ago, before it was mandatory to, while they were still issuing plastic bags to shoppers. So the experiment was elegantly designed by Tatiana Homanoff and her associates, where they looked at retail, different shops which had different policies about plastic bags. So one was a control where you could take whatever you wanted and there was no consequences. The second set of shops, you took your bag to. If you took a reusable bag, you got a credit. You got a 5-cent credit. The other one, the final set, they charged you 5 cents if they had to give you a bag. Okay, which is standard practice in New York, it's standard practice in San Francisco, and as a proud Irishman, I can tell you that Ireland started this thing off about 15 years ago. Now, what we're going to do, next slide please, so I'm going to do it like in quick succession. So what they found was that when there was no incentive, about 13% of people bought their reusable bags. What do you think the effect of a 5-cent a 5-cent reward was on this number? Anybody want to guess? 14%. Who said that? 14%. 1-4. Anybody else? 2. Even less than the control. Well, 15.4. You've just won yourself a book. What do you think the effect of the tax was? 20? 25? 25? Anybody else? 25? 40? 40? 50? Yeah. Whoever said 40 gets the prize as well. But this is interesting. This is interesting to me because, this is a very, very small incentive. I mean, 5 cents is not really a lot to most Americans. But just the idea of even just kind of having to pay that 5 cents you don't want to pay, there is a research that suggests that when we pay for something, you see activity in the insula, which is the part of the brain which measures disgust and pain as well, or sorry, is activated by disgust and pain as well. And so it's kind of, it really is something that hits us in this gut, this idea of losing something. Now, what's interesting to me, though, is you can use loss aversion to persuade people to do things. You can, and increasingly I see advertising messages which, rather than saying save $400 on your cellular bill, say don't lose $400 on your cellular bill. So that's kind of good that they're using that framing. But really, from the perspective of behavior change, the real effect of loss aversion is this, which is that actually sort of when you're trying to get people to change behavior, it's not that people are resistant to change, but they're resistant to the loss that change entails. And where I'm going with this is that every change, whether you're trying to get people to adopt something, whether you're trying to get people to give something up, involves a loss of some sort or another. One of the people who sort of seemed to know this, I'm sure you recognize Marie Kondo. You all know Marie Kondo. Marie Kondo changed my life. I'm now a sort of almost to a point of being dysfunctional. I'm sort of folding my underpants and my socks and I'm kind of looking how neat they are. I haven't quite got to color coding them yet. But so Marie Kondo's book, I think it's called The Life-Changing Joy of Tidying Up, and of course her Netflix series which came out. When I first read her book, I was actually quite inspired by it. And this is a couple of years ago, and I started writing a couple of posts about it. Because she is embracing, without realizing she was doing it, she's embracing some core principles from behavioral science. So, Marie Kondo, if you read her story about the backstory, it's amazing. She says, she obviously was a bit of a neat freak when she was growing up. And she's like, she talks about how I was trying to tidy my bedroom. And the pressure, the emotional pressure of deciding what to throw out made me pass out. She kind of fainted. And she's lying unconscious in her room, having fainted from kind of trying to sort of figure out what to throw out. And during that period of unconsciousness, she had an epiphany, which was, I'm asking the wrong question. The question I should be asking is, what should I keep? And this is from a behavioral science perspective, this is a bravo Marie Kondo, because what she did in that, by reframing that question, she overcame loss aversion. I had things I'd kept. I had a goalkeeping jersey I wore when I was like, the last time I played soccer, which was when I was about 25 years old, and I kept it. Maybe it'll come in handy for a sort of Halloween costume or something like that. Or maybe, I've got these things, maybe I'm going to grow back into them, or maybe it's going to come back into fashion. And all of those were really just excuses not to divest myself of these things. Because getting rid of stuff is a loss. And what she did was she helped me and millions of others reframe that barrier to tidying up and kind of being more efficient about how you kept your things, by simply reframing that thing of getting rid of stuff, not as a loss, but by focusing on what you want to keep. She does another couple of things as well. She gets you to focus on whether something, I'm sure you're familiar with this, she asks you to touch stuff and says, does it spark joy? This is a really interesting thing as well, because what she's doing is getting you to think about that thing now, rather than maybe I'll use it in the future, maybe I'll want it in the future. And so she's also overcoming a cognitive bias called hyperbolic discounting as well. So there she is, Happiness and the Art of Tidying Up. She figured out that what people might lose or fear losing was an impediment to actually the behavior she wanted people to adopt. I was giving a talk I've been very lucky in places I've given a talk. So I was giving a talk at the United Nations Center in Addis Ababa. And one of the speakers was a guy called Kumi Naidoo, who is a really he's a big guy in the NGO world. At the time was an activist in South Africa. And he was telling the story of how a community he was involved in a project for to bring running water to their village. They had to, if they wanted water, what they had to do was walk about 2.5 miles to a river, get the water in buckets, and bring it back to their houses. And what they did was, this was the task of the teenagers, of the adolescents. They were all sent to get the water, that was their job, and bring the water back. So, they came up with this idea, we could really kind of help these people if we put a water pipe in place and actually sort of brought the water from the river to the village, so they didn't have to do it. And after a week, they installed this. This is not the actual picture, but they installed a spigot and a pump and a pipe. After a week, somebody had sabotaged it, taken the handle off the spigot. They put the handle back. After a week later, somebody blocks it up. Another week later, so they fix it. Another week later, somebody does something else to it. So what's kind of going on here? And fortunately, there was an anthropologist in the community at the time. And one of the things I really love doing is partnering what I do with anthropologists, because they are so good at understanding context and what's happening and what is the scenario of the behavior you're trying to change. And what she noticed was that actually sort of the people who are doing this by talking to it was the adolescent boys. It's the prime suspect for most bad behavior is the adolescent boys. But why were they doing it? And the reason was that what they were reacting to was the loss of this hour and a half of freedom they had every day, where they would go with their friends, where romances would start, and they were free from the overseeing eyes of adults to go and get this water. And so this loss led them to actually sort of strike out against the thing that was causing their loss. And what I said to Kumi was, what you probably would need to do if this happens again is try to replace, mitigate that loss, create another social situation where the people who are involved in getting the water still get the social benefits without them having to sort of turn the clock back and kind of be Luddite and disrupt the water supply. Next slide. There's a picture of me in Africa that's not really very relevant to anything. Sorry, next slide. Great case. I don't know if any of you follow I know the David Ogilvy Awards are wonderful, but there's also the Jay Chiat Awards, which is a competitive award set run by the 4As. This is an ad that won the Jay Chiat Award a couple of years ago, a campaign that did. And it's for Kraft macaroni and cheese, as you can see. So Kraft, I didn't grow up with Kraft macaroni and cheese, so I'm not particularly partial to it. But for many Americans, it's kind of like it's a comfort food of their childhood. It's something that people feel very strongly about. And the bad news was that actually there's a lot of not very good stuff in Kraft macaroni and cheese. I mean, colors and flavors. And Kraft said, we've got to do something about this. So they started by, they found they could make something which tasted just as good and had the same texture, and they didn't have the E-colors and the additives in it. So they took it to market, new Kraft mac and cheese. And they hit a stumbling block because people weren't buying it. And they did research around this. In fact, I think they did research. They didn't take it to market. When they took this concept into research, we said, oh, get that out of here. I don't want this new Kraft macaroni and cheese. I want my old Kraft macaroni and cheese. So what they did, and their agency, Crispin Porter, suggested was that they should actually just launch it without telling anybody. So, I mean, they did all the legal stuff they needed to do by putting changing the ingredients on the back, telling you what was in it, but they didn't flag in any way that they had changed the recipe. And then 6 months, 9 months later, they ran a campaign like this. We would invite you to try it, but you already have. When we took the artificial flavors, preservatives, and dyes out of Kraft macaroni and cheese, we wanted to be sure it still tasted like Kraft macaroni cheese, mac and cheese you know and love. So 3 months ago, we quietly started selling the new recipe in our old boxes to see if you'd notice. And your silence spoke volumes. After all, it's pretty hard to speak with your mouth full. Yeah. But it was an interesting approach, which is they overcame. The problem was that people had the sense of loss. This loss was acting. It's like if you're going to take something out of this product, I know, you're changing it. It's not going to be the product I knew. So you've created a sense of loss. By actually doing it first and then saying, you still like it, they overcame that. They managed to mitigate against that sense of loss.
What was the incentive to say anything at all?
That's a good question.
In some theory,
Yeah.
I could be a little frustrated by your lack of transparency.
Sure. Yeah. So I think they wanted to know people they were doing. Sorry, I've lost you. I think they wanted people to know they were doing the right thing. So I think that kind of drove it. So it was kind of like, as an organization, they were committed to making as many of their products as they could, as healthy as they could be, given what was in them. So I think that was probably it. And I think as well, for some people, it might have been a barrier to purchase. I mean, the idea that it had these artificial additives might have been a barrier to purchase. So they may have opened up a base of people who were rejecting the product, who might have once been into it but have got healthier attitudes since then, or healthy behavior since then, and were now not in the franchise. So I guess that would be it. But you're quite right. They could have just kept on doing it.
There's also been a lot of research that companies have been adopting and show that transparency is a positive
Yes.
thing, and it gets consumers to come in by being more
Entice people.
Sure. Yeah.
transparent, so that a
Yeah.
lot of companies feel like now we have to be kind of
Yeah.
over-explanatory what's in it.
Yeah, and maybe that's why they did that afterwards as well, because they felt that need. I mean, even if they weren't transparent in the beginning, at least they were being transparent a little while afterwards. This is an interesting point. So we find this. So many of these behavioural insights kind of work in a non-conscious factor, so in a non-conscious way. So a question is it manipulation, and is that manipulation a bad thing? And if you're using it to get people to donate their organs, that's a good thing, but is it a bad thing you're using manipulation? And the evidence actually is and this is not across the whole field, but actually even when you tell people that you're using a behavioral mechanism, it still seems to have an effect. So one thing which is a very, very useful mechanism is defaults. So and this relates to the ease thing I talked about. So if you kind of make it so that people have to opt out of something, so if you take organ donation, rather than saying I'm opting into organ donation, I have to opt out, the rates are staggering. It goes from, I think, sort of 8 or 9% in Germany, where you have to opt in to give your organs, to about 95% in Austria, which is culturally quite similar, where you actually have to uncheck a box. And so people have criticized this as a manipulation. What they found is that if you actually tell people the default is in place, even if you reveal your nudge, as it were, it still has, it's pretty uncontaminated in terms of the effect it has. So transparency may also be a good thing to apply to behavioral science insights as well. Oh, sorry, can we go back one? I don't know what the noise to make for is that, but so this is from all the workshops I do. I kind of have been collecting these reasons why. What might people lose by doing the thing you want to do? So I add to this list all the time. I mean, sometimes it's obvious things like time or money, but it can be status. What you're asking people might mean that there's a loss of status involved. Asking people to drive a smaller car or a Prius rather than a Maserati, might have an effect on their status. It can be convenience. I mean, there are things that you can ask people to do which might feel they're losing their individuality. They might be losing. I mean, many of these. I mean, sort of, you might be, by asking people to drive more slowly, maybe they're losing a sense of excitement. And so one of the things that I try to do is to get everybody I work with to think about what is the thing, what things might people be losing in adopting the behavior you want them to adopt. So let's take an example. So I think Leslie, you had an example which was about trying to get your customers at Citibank to embrace more products from. So can you just explain the situation a little bit?
So we had a lot of information from our clients in terms of industries that they're in and their revenue sizes and the typical products that they would use. And so with that research, we were using that to help build profiles for the types of clients we wanted to attract. And we would look at these lists and see the typical products that they would purchase. But we struggled with actually getting our customers to purchase those products, even though we would find, according to benchmarking data, that everyone in that industry, in pharma, is in this particular revenue segment, was
Use
using
those
that
products.
particular product.
So it was difficult to get people, even though they were using one product, it was difficult to cross-sell them on other products.
Correct.
So it's interesting. What might people, it's conceivable that people might have felt they were losing something by doing that. What do you think they might, anybody got any thoughts on what people might have been losing?
Maybe it's a sense of routine, or something that they come to get used to a system that they create for themselves that
Sure.
they think is optimal.
Yeah.
And now they're losing that.
Yeah, you're asking them to change, but they've got these people they've worked with already. And we know getting people to change their bank accounts is difficult, so it's kind of, you're asking me to, and that's an ease thing as well. So they're losing a sense of routine, and it's also a more difficult thing. There's a lot of work behind the scenes they might need to do. That's interesting. Anything else that people might feel they were losing? Absolutely. So it's kind of, I'm now committed to. Oh, there you go. Yeah, it's probably not romance, is it? No, all virility. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, they've got this flexibility. You're asking them to put more of their eggs in the same basket. So there's kind of a sense of the loss is that hedging they have against risk in some way. And it may be that they're almost, and I think we talked about this earlier on, it may be that they feel they're losing a bit of their corporate individuality. They are this organization which relates to your routine point that does these things because that suits how their business. And everybody wants to think their business is unique, and maybe by doing it in the way that other people are doing it, you're sort of fighting against that sense of uniqueness. I think, with anything, and with any choice you're trying to get people to make, it's kind of work out what might be lost. So I think when I asked John about what he would like people to do that they're not doing, he wanted to explain what it was.
Busyness is like the new currency, so how do you... it seems to be that busyness is the new currency, and people are afraid to say no to things, but busyness is making people kind of miserable and overwhelmed, so learning to say no.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because so there's a number of reasons why you might not say no, but by saying no, you're kind of turning down potential opportunities. So there is that kind of loss of something that might happen in the future. No is almost the word of loss in a way. So I think if I was the campaign to get people to say no more often, I would kind of figure out how actually so they were less likely to lose these things and more. You can talk about the upside, which is the gain. But you've also got to say, actually, no, you don't lose as much as you think by doing that. Most of those things probably don't come to something, and it allows you to focus on the things that do. So if you've got any words you want to add to this list, every time I do a workshop, I get 4 or 5 more words to put on it. I'm going to reach a point of data overload with people because I'm going to have so many reasons of things that people might lose. Can we move on to the... Sorry. So the thing for me is, before thinking about what people might gain from doing or choosing something, really think about what they might lose. And the question for market researchers is, how good actually are we at asking that question and finding out what people may fear losing and what the potential loss of an action might be? You can do it through qualitative research, but most qualitative research is not tuned to doing it. This is one of the things, as I said, I like working with anthropologists because they're really good at kind of reading between the lines and kind of seeing in a situation what people might be losing in. Another area is, another reason why people may not do something is other people aren't doing it. I gave the example of life insurance. But let's go on to the next slide, sorry. Robert Cialdini, the author of Influence, tells us that our intuitions tell us that a baby... Sorry, there's a slide before that. I think we skipped one. Yeah. Our intuitions tell us that behavior is more correct to the degree we see other people doing it. This is the concept Jason talked about, social proof, which is we're almost drawn towards things that we see other people doing. You've all been in the situation. There's a restaurant which is empty, and you can get in there immediately, or there's one which you've got to wait 45 minutes for, and then it's full. And your gut literally will not let you go into that restaurant which is empty. You wait the 45 minutes. My theory is that every successful restaurant has a restaurant nearby where they pay the restaurateur not to let people in so they look like they're busier and they've got the social proof thing. But equally, it's true to say our intuitions tell us the behavior is less correct to the degree we don't feel other people doing it. So if you don't see people doing something, you don't get that social cue. I talked about life insurance, my project in Asia, a bit back. One of the issues with life insurance generally is, I don't know whether you've got life insurance, you don't know whether I've got life insurance, there's no visible cues about it, so you don't really get a sense as to whether it's the correct behavior. This is why I think the things that blood donors, when you go and give blood, they give you a little ticket to say, I gave blood. That's a genius idea. And the I voted stickers are really, really good things as well. But it's something to think about. How do you make, if you want somebody to adopt something, how do you make that invisible behavior visible? How are we doing for time, Carol?
It's 6:40.
So I'm pretty much out of time, aren't I? 5 minutes more, maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's skip the next couple of slides. So go back one, actually. This is an interesting. This is a billboard that I saw in LAX during the water shortage. Anybody want to tell me what's wrong with this as a message? It's a bit like when I got a message, I live in San Francisco, which said, only 12% of Californians have earthquake insurance. What they're doing there is telling me that the behavior that they don't want me to adopt is adopted by many people, which is actually 88% of people don't have earthquake insurance. The problem with this as a message is you're setting up the idea that people take 20-minute showers. So you're creating almost a social norm. Even though they're trying to get people to take 5-minute showers, they've kind of set up the notion of a 20-minute shower before they do it. So really kind of just sort of instead of what they really should be doing is telling you more and more people are taking showers that are less than 5 minutes, rather than suggesting that there is actually behavior in place which is 20-minute showers. Again, I'm going to click through a couple of slides here. It's a pity because these ones are kind of interesting, but so I think let's go back to a question then. So of the choices that we're talking about, let's take Leslie's choice again. She wants people to cross-buy products from Citibank. Do people actually know that other people are doing this? Do you actually say that, kind of many people are doing this, or people like you are doing this, or do you use that notion of social proof in this choice enough?
Yes.
You do? Okay. So, well, then that's not going to work. Well, there may be ways that you can refine it, but actually in the no question, I think the social norm is to say yes. And so if we're running this campaign, which you and I are going to do to get people to say no, maybe what one needs to do is kind of say, more and more people are saying no, but kind of create some social proof that no is more of a social norm than people think it is. So the final area, which I will do in less than 5 minutes, because I know we've run out of time, is future benefits don't motivate action now. So another reason why people don't do things is because there's not, this is kind of every salesperson will tell you this, there's no payoff at the moment. And humans are predisposed to taking a smaller reward now over a larger one later. This is called hyperbolic discounting. A classic example of this is, there's a tribe and a culture in South Africa who speak through clicks, and I think I'm actually sort of going to become fluent in this language by the end of but this is a classic sort of behavioral science experiment, which is you say to people, do you want, I do this at conferences and I talk quite a lot, do you want $50 now or $100 in a year's time? And about yeah, I'm going to do it now, yeah. I've done it where I've held up money, that's as much as I've done. No, I'm not. You can talk to your friends at the ARF and see if they're prepared to do it, but I'm not. So this is not a real life experiment, this is hypothetical. So do you want $50 now or $100 in a year's time? About 60, 70, 80% of people will normally take the $50 now rather than the $100 in a year's time. If you flip the frame around on that and you say, do you want $50 in a week's time or $100 in a year and 1 week's time, which from an economic perspective is exactly the same thing, it's a year apart, then you get about 60, 70, 80% of people saying, I'll take the $100. So we're kind of tuned to taking things in the short term, and it's called hyperbolic discounting because we discount, even though this number is spelled out as $100, we discount future value. $100 in the future is worth less than $50 is now. Some Dutch researchers did a great experiment where they asked people before a conference, did they want a healthy snack, a banana, or did they want an unhealthy one, a piece of candy? They didn't say unhealthy, they just said, do you want a banana or do you want chocolate? But what happened was, even though people had said, about 80% of people said they wanted the healthy snack, when it came to it, when they were there making the choice, they didn't make people stick to it. They found that actually about 40% of people, only about 40% of people took the banana and about 60% took the chocolate. So there's an interesting thing here because it's about our relationship with time. Actually, let's talk about this slide where we're here. What happens? So this is an interesting slide to think about in terms of people's motivations, which is that what we tend to focus on very often, this happens in healthcare a lot, is things that do good and are functional in the future. Go to the gym now and you'll be healthy in the future. But really what motivates people are things which have what is known as hedonic utility, but what feels good now. So if you're in the business of selling insurance, or if you're trying to get people to adopt a future behavior, what's really important, even though there might be massive benefits to that future behavior, try to find something which feels good in the present. I think one of the issues with research is we ask people what they will or won't do in a different level of consumer. What I mean by that is we're so often in research we're saying, would you buy this product? What's your next car going to be? But we're asking people to think about things in a time frame which doesn't relate to the decision. So it's really important to try to find ways of aligning the time frame of when you're asking people with that of which they will actually choose. I'd love to talk about this very quickly because it's a great neuroeconomics experiment. This was done by a guy called Hal Hershfield about 6 or 7 years ago. And what he did was he asked people to think about themselves as present self, think about themselves now, think about themselves in the future, think about another person in now and another person in the future. And what he did while he was doing this was he was measuring And you have to be a bit careful with any neural measures, but he was measuring a part of the brain called the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, which is associated with thinking about self, so self-concept or information which relates to yourself. And what he did was he looked at how this was activated when people were thinking of these 4 states. So you can see here one of these is an outlier. And so it's kind of funny because kind of you've got 2 present, 2 future, 2 self, 2 other, yet one of them is an outlier and 3 follow the same course. Anybody want to guess which one is the outlier? Present self, future self. Actually, present self is the outlier. So what's interesting is that even if you're thinking about yourself in the future, it's almost like you're thinking, it's more similar to thinking about someone else than it is thinking about yourself. And financial institutions have used this. There's a whole thing with face.com, but actually presenting people with an aged image of themselves will help them kind of make decisions that have future consequences. So if you want somebody to save for retirement, actually showing them a picture of themselves aging will encourage them to do that. As I found, I thought I had the slides in, but I kind of aged a picture of myself. I did it a couple of years ago, and now it just looks like I look now. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff about our future self. This is about language. I'm not going to get into it now. But one question, just going back to our choices, let's take the recycling plastic choice. How might this notion, I mean, sort of, so many of the benefits of not using plastic are in the future. We were working with a company that was talking about how in 50 years' time there'll be more plastic than fish in the ocean. The problem with that is that 50 years' time is such a long time horizon. So how might you kind of get people to reduce plastic now? What would be things that you could do? I mean, one way you can tell people it's a long-term problem, but is there anything you could do shorter term? Make them, as I had with that slide, it's not just about doing good in the future, it's about feeling good now. I mean, there could be things where you create rewards, you create badges. There's one theory about hybrid cars, which is that people don't drive them really because they care about the environment, because they want to be seen. It's an immediate signal that I care about the environment and I'm a good person. Our neighbors in San Francisco have a Nissan Leaf which they park outside. They've got a big enough garage to park it inside, but they park it outside so everybody can see it. But every time I walk past the house, they've got all the lights on. I mean, it's just inconsistent. They're kind of like, but really, I think they're really managing their impression that they are somebody who cares about the environment. What I'm really, the kind of whole topic of really what I'm talking about here is that if you can understand why people aren't doing what you need them to do, especially at the behavioral level, it gives you the opportunity to, this is where the clicking becomes a bit unnatural, to release them from don't. And that's really, I think, sort of something which is the first step of marketing. How do you release people from the things that are stopping them from doing what you want to do? And I don't like barriers, because barriers makes it sound like a hurdle. Very often it's just a question of making it easy. How do you give them permission to adopt the path? And if you do that, you might be able to make do a natural and easy choice. So if we have time for questions, I'd love to try to answer some. I know we've gone a little bit over. Anybody got anything they would like to ask about?
I can start with some questions.
Okay.
So you talked a lot about finance and insurance. Everything that I've seen says that by far emotional advertising in finance works far better than what's called rational advertising. So probably the classic example of that is USAA, which is insurance for service. And if you look at those ads, every other word is heart, help, home. It's the semiotics of it. H is like the warmest word because it sounds like home. Do you think they have it right, that emotion sells financial institutions better?
Well, so, I mean, I think certainly rational financial messages probably will not. I think there's an interesting debate about emotion because I think it's an important part, but it's not the only thing that moves people towards choice. And so it kind of almost depends on how you define emotion. But you're really talking there about tugging the heartstrings. What I think you also have to do is, I would say, tug the gut strings as well. And these are the things I'm talking about. You know, understanding how you can make the choice seem like a natural and intuitive one. So a lot of what they're doing, so you take those, if you're really creating a sense of community and that this brand is a brand that is for a group of people. So what's the most, there's a really famous insurance company which serves people from the armed forces. Yeah. I mean, they get their kind of off the screen in terms, off the charts in terms of customer satisfaction and stuff like that. I mean, part of that is probably social proof as well. It's this idea that many people like you do this thing that kind of makes it seem like an instinctive and easy choice. So I think tapping into emotions is really, really, really important, partly because it helps. I mean, storytelling is essentially about tapping into the emotions, but I don't think it's enough in itself. I think you still need to, I mean, ideally you're talking about head, heart and gut working together. So I think what I always try to encourage people to do is to kind of, how do you, as I say, tug the gut strings as well as the heart strings?
Any questions?
Oh, yeah, I've got one.
Hi.
My question is around, going back to loss aversion. So what are some of the frameworks or choices that you make about how to go after that? Because some are unconscious, so you can't just attack them. Sometimes your experience or brand experience is designed to address some of those losses. So what are some of the processes or steps that you go through to evaluate which losses you can apply?
So,
How explicit do you do it?
yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the first thing is that anything that comes from a behavioral perspective, and you know, these behavioral insights one should use as inspiration. And there's unfortunately, I think people think it's kind of proof that this stuff is going to work. Oh, it's based on science. And that's not the case, because once you wrap something up in a bit of creativity, it becomes a different object anyhow. So, so the first thing that I sort of ask people is when we're thinking about the losses, I mean, that's often based on research. As I said, anthropological research can be a great way of kind of getting a sense of what those losses might be. But then you really have to kind of put that into an intervention. It almost becomes part of the creative brief for the intervention, or for the advertising or the messaging or whatever it is. And then you have to do a behavioral test on what comes out of it. So really the only way to tell if any of these things are working is to try either use real life behavior or some kind of behavioral proxy to see whether this intervention has had an effect on behavior. So that's kind of what I encourage people to do. It's kind of do your behavioral exploratory research, kind of work out what might be the candidate mechanisms. I was in a meeting, came up twice actually, in a meeting today and yesterday I was having with a couple of organizations where they were asking, how do I test loss aversion? Well, you don't want to test loss aversion. What you want to do is see what an intervention based on loss aversion might do. We did a project some time ago where we had 6 different interventions. 3 of them were based on loss aversion, but they were losses in different ways. So a lot of it is just you know, kind of doing behavioral testing. So kind of you take these as inspiration, you have hypotheses, but then you test them, because otherwise really all you're doing is just going with a hypothesis. So I mean, it's an important question, because I think behavioral science is now becoming more popular within organizations, and people are just kind of doing what I call heuristics by numbers. It's kind of like, oh, let's see if social proof is going to work because we need more people. But really you do have to, you take a rigorous scientific approach and do behavioral tests. Does that answer the question? Great.
Right, thank you.
Super. Why don't we give everybody a few minutes to have their mojito of choice? And I'm sure Matthew will stay around. Let's have a huge round of applause. That was totally awesome, Matthew. Really appreciate your.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
You're a great storyteller. David, click. Super. Last announcement, we're doing a benchmark survey. If you go to the website, you can take it. It takes 10 minutes. If you take the benchmark survey, you'll get a copy of the report. It basically is about the changing roles of research and insights. What are our members calling themselves? How are they structuring? What skill set are they looking for? It's only 10 minutes, and you'll get a copy of the report if you do take the survey. So encourage you. And I'd like to thank our sponsors who are responsible for the mojitos and the food out there, GFK and Spark Neuro. They've been sponsors of the entire Salon program. So let's give them a round of applause also. And I think that's a wrap.